Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who are not in planning, I see we have some other faces. Good to see. My name is Jim Spencer. I'm the chair of the Department of Planning, Development, and Preservation. And it's my honor to introduce Dr. Patrice Flowers from the University of Hawaii, who has just flown in this morning and not worse for wear. She'll be here for the next couple of days and talking about some of her research. She's a former colleague from University of Hawaii, and so I am quite proud to invite her out here to talk about some of her research. Just a little bit of background. She is a political scientist trained at the University of Minnesota. She's an associate professor of political science, has been deeply involved in study abroad, speaks Japanese pretty fluently at this point, and does a lot of work on international relations, on refugee rights, human rights, trafficking, and civil society. But I think one of the most important themes that underlies all of her work in the Japan context is that it has central to its perspective is an emphasis on fairness and justice. And why I wanted to bring her out to talk about her work to you all during this year that we're talking about race in the university is for that reason. But also for that reason in a very different context. Sometimes we kind of talk about race in the university here in the US and here on campus and in South Carolina and the South and those kinds of contexts. And it becomes very familiar. But we have to realize that we live in a global world. We have to realize that there are many bigger issues out there than simply what's going on here in South Carolina or on campus. But some of the themes are similar. But we want to know exactly how they're similar, how they're different. And I think Patrice is in a fairly unique position to help us understand some of these differences, but also to learn something of our own about this context and how we can apply it to our own context. For those of you who are in the planning departments, I think it has a lot of interesting components and ways to link into our focus on urban planning. And in particular, coming from political science, I think it's important for us to always realize that when we plan things, when we do public policy, it's never apolitical. There's always a political story behind what we do because it's a public action. Coming from political science, in the context of Japan, it'll be interesting to see how Japan deals with its differences, right? What are those differences? How does it identify them? How does it discuss them public or not discuss them publicly? Patrice, I think, is going to talk for about between 45 minutes and an hour, and hopefully you'll have some interesting questions. For those of you who are not in planning, definitely feel free to pipe in with a question or two here and there. And maybe Patrice will also share some of her general impressions about working in Japan and how she got interested in this stuff. She's been involved heavily with study abroad at the University of Hawaii, which is one of its biggest programs is in Japan. So with that, help me welcome Patrice to our speaker series.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to come out here and speak. I'm really excited always to share my research. Today I'm going to talk about the politics of race, global norms and local realities in Japan. And so I just want to start off by situating this a little bit in a recent scholarly discussion around the connection between municipal initiatives and national policies. So there's a really nice article that was published last August called Planning in the Multicultural City, Celebrating Diversity and Reinforcing Difference. And basically what the authors do is they use 8 cities as the organizing principle for this article. And what they do is they categorize these cities based on the relationship between those municipal initiatives and national policies. So their first category, as you can see here, is municipal initiatives that are used as tools for implementing multicultural policies. And here they use Toronto, Sydney, London, and Amsterdam as their examples. Their second category is one where municipal interventions resist national views of multiculturalism, And here their examples are Berlin and New York. Third, they have municipal and national views of multiculturalism as tightly integrated. And here they use the examples of Singapore and Johannesburg. I actually think that they could have included a fourth category where municipal interventions resist national views of a homogeneous nation, such as the case in Tokyo. And this would yield interesting insights into the dilemmas that's facing East Asian nations as they confront issues of multiculturalism in the 21st century. So the overall argument, and I'm not going to talk very much about the theoretical parts of this paper. I really want to give you much more of the empirical information, and that way we'll have a much more interesting discussion, especially if you're not very familiar with the context of Japan. But overall, I think that when national policy is resistant to immigration, national policy that is resistant to immigration is at odds with the local reality, as in the case of Japan. Local governments attempt to manage the meaning of local places in ways that help integrate foreign residents. Okay, so that there's a real conflict between the national vision of the society as expressed through immigration laws and other kinds of policies that deal with foreign residents, and what actually is happening on the ground. So there's a real tension there. Now, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to show you a few photos while I read a little bit to you, just because I want to tell you a story to set the background. It'll help to give you a little bit of the context. You might not get all of the vocabulary and place names and that yet, but I'll continue to refer back to them throughout the talk. So hopefully by the end it'll sound a little bit more familiar. So this is a stairwell at a station in Tokyo. In the stairwell at the Okubo-dori exit of Tokyo's Yamanote train line Shin-Okubo Station, a sign in Japanese declares, "There's a little Korea in Shinjuku." At the bottom of the stairs, a large plaque written in both Korean and Japanese tells a story of a Korean student who lost his life trying to save a Japanese man who had fallen onto the tracks. Exiting the station and walking to the right, down the restaurant-lined street, even a casual observer is struck by the significant Korean presence in Okubo. A few steps away from the exit, one restaurant has erected a street stall out front where a 30-something man in stylish glasses and hip hairstyle is selling freshly grilled chijimi and hotoku, Korean snacks, while a loudspeaker announces special promotional offers in Korean, Japanese, and English. Encouraging the growth of an ethnic town in Okubo allows the government to demonstrate its ability to manage foreigners in a country that insists on not being or becoming an immigrant country. As an ethnic town, Okubo is politically and socially constructed as a multicultural space where diversity can be readily consumed, even as the identity of specific groups of real people is erased. The area generally known as Okubo is physically contained by 4 main avenues, with Shokuan-dori, which is shown here, the street that divides Okubo and Kabukicho, which is a large entertainment district, being the most porous. In addition, Okubo's historical connection to Kabukicho makes it easy to extend the strategies employed to contain the potential pollution of red light districts to containing another socially disruptive element, foreigners. As the number of male foreign workers increased in Okubo and Kabukicho in the 1980s, a new morality law, which took effect in February 1985, limited the operation hours of sex-related businesses. Most of these foreigners are Korean, a fact that is highlighted when it's convenient, helps create a relationship between Japanese and Koreans that challenges historical animosities that are still central to the local level, to the national level relations. As long as Okubo does not become understood as specifically Korean, the Zainichi Koreans of Japan These are resident Koreans that are descendants of people who came to Japan as part of Japan's colonial legacy, and other internal differences can be forgotten, even as the number of newcomer Koreans continues to increase. So in the 1990s, Okubo was already an ethnically diverse area, but official policymakers interpreted this diversity very differently than diversity under multicultural programs and policies referred to as Tabunka Kyosei policies. And you'll see the word up on the slides. I'll refer to it and try to also use multicultural at the same time. In the public imagination, the area was closely connected to Kabukicho, that red light district, as a place with a concentration of vice, crime, and foreigners. Kirino Natsuo's novel Grotesque demonstrates this in its portrayal of Okubo as a place even more dangerous and polluted than Kabukicho. In Kabukicho, sex workers worked inside clubs, bars, and other organized spaces that catered mainly to Japanese clients. But in Okubo, they were streetwalkers, trolling for customers among the quote-unquote foreign workers, understood as Asian men from poor countries. These foreign workers would take them to nearby seedy love hotels or shabby wooden mokuzo apartments, you can see one here, that were often not very much more than flop houses. Kirino's story dramatizes the danger of the area when a quote-unquote illegal Chinese migrant worker in Okubo kills one of the two prostitutes central to the story. The murdered woman herself is an embodiment of Japan's internal difference given her biracial parentage. Local residents and officials viewed efforts to clean up Kabukicho, which began, as I said earlier, in the 1980s and intensified in the 1990s and early 2000s, as necessary to maintain the area as an entertainment destination and to prevent its total disintegration into a red light district. This period marks the beginning of the transformation and emergence of Okubo, first as an ethnic space, then as internationalized Okubo, and finally as ethnic town Okubo. And I'll spend most of my time here today talking about this place as an ethnic town. Before we talk more about the local level though, I want to talk a little bit about global norms of multiculturalism, okay? International human rights law protects minorities and takes multicultural societies for granted. It aims to protect minorities from discrimination by international agreements such as the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and to ensure their economic, cultural, and social well-being and rights through two main conventions. One, the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the other, the International Convention on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. These norms are diffused internationally, and we can document this through the reform and repeal of exclusionary immigration policies. So these included the U.S. Immigration Act of 1965, the end of the White Australia policies in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and Canada's 1976 Immigration Act, which instituted non-discrimination selection criteria for migrants entering Canada. More recently, the 1991 establishment of policies encouraging professionals from Asia to migrate to New Zealand. These are all examples of how the global norm of multiculturalism is spread through immigration policies and national laws. So now returning to the context of Japan and thinking about difference within Japan. Does anyone know very much about immigration to Japan, about Japanese society, about migrants, minorities? What do you know? Do you mind sharing?
I've been to Japan twice now, studying abroad after high school, and once through Clemson and the Japan Foundation. And my experiences there, the immigration rules are pretty strict,
Mm-hmm.
a lot
Mm-hmm.
not have it outnumbered too much.
Uh-huh.
I, as a, I mean, I never really saw that many people outside of like teachers and people with worker visas. I've heard those are pretty hard to get.
Okay.
So.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. I put you on the spot. Thanks a lot. Anybody else want to add anything or? Okay, right on. What's your name? Maria. Right on, Maria. There's a popular understanding in Japan that difference comes from outside, and that difference is often framed as a threat. Okay, and that idea is very interesting, but it actually ignores the more historical development of difference within Japan, right? Of course, consolidating the nation was one of the processes that tried to incorporate people who had originally not been viewed as Japanese. So the indigenous Ainu in northern Japan, Okinawans in the southern stretches of the archipelago, both of those had historically been seen as outsiders, right? But when Japan was consolidating the nation at the end of the 1800s, they drew heavily from Western ideas of race to actually figure out how to include these people who had been previously understood as foreigners into the Japanese nation. So Ainu and Okinawans actually went from being understood as foreigners to being understood as backward, okay? So they're part of us, they're just still developing, okay? So there's that. There's also the history of colonization. I mean, we know that a lot of diversity stemmed from colonial pursuits. That's no different in Japan. The end of the 1800s, they colonized Taiwan. Beginning of the 1900s, Korea. Movement of colonized and colonizers was actually intensified during the Pacific War when labor was forced, especially from Korea to Japan. So there's this aspect of forced migration. That's a legacy of difference in Japan as well. And then we also have immigration, of course. All of these really have a focus on ethnic diversity that is about outsiders coming in. And this also, what's interesting is that it does ignore other kinds of diversity, okay? So it ignores issues of sexual minorities. It ignores issues of Burakumin, who are the descendants of historical outcast groups. It actually ignores, the difference that comes from ability and disability. And all of these are very important parts of Japanese society. And if you have questions about that, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but if you want to talk about it in Q&A, we certainly can do that. So let's think more about immigration policy. And as Maria said, immigration policy in Japan is very strict, right? It's incredibly restrictive, and the government's approach actually nourishes this myth of a homogeneous Japan, okay? I think the immigration policy is also very hierarchical. Immigration status is really based on your visa status, and the different people from different nations have access to different kinds of visas, okay? So two really good examples of this are the Technical Intern Training Program visa. This is a 3-year visa that was created in the 1990s, in part to deal with labor shortages in Japan. And it does not allow family, okay? So the category was ostensibly created to allow people from neighboring Asian countries to come to Japan for training, okay? And after this 3-year period, the argument is they'll go home and be, with increased skills and be able to make more money, make a better living. In the 1990s, labor is still short. There's a creation of another visa category. This is limited to Nikkeijin. These are the descendants of Japanese immigrants to South America, primarily Brazil and Peru, okay? Brazil has the largest overseas ethnic Japanese population. So really encouraging people to come back. And scholars of immigration in Japan readily recognize that part of the reason why this category was created, and there was a focus on what is often referred to as Japanese Brazilian, Nikkei-jin, descendants of Japanese immigrants, really was this idea that they are culturally Japanese, and so they won't have any problems assimilating, okay? Mind you, some of these people are, you know, second, maybe third generation Brazilians. Their faces might look Japanese, but government quickly found out that, you know, there was quite a cultural gap there, okay? But Nikkei-jin are in a very privileged position because they have a 3-year visa that's renewable. And eventually they were also allowed to bring non-Japanese spouses and children. What's interesting about Japanese immigration policy, though, you know, despite these two categories that I'm using as examples, is that, one, there's no immigration allowed for low and unskilled labor, what we might think of as blue-collar labor, okay? So there's that. But you remember the technical intern training program actually is a program where people come and work. And Nikkei-jin, unlike some of the other visa categories, are given permission to work freely. And what you see is brokers that emerge, large Nikkei-jin populations around industrial centers such as the town of Toyota, working in auto industry and other places like that. Okay. Another thing that's really interesting about immigration policy in Japan and about immigrants in general in Japan is there is no discussion of immigrants in Japanese immigrant policy. Okay, the word imin does not appear in the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act. Instead, foreign nationals are referred to. Okay, when people talk amongst themselves, just chatting in everyday life, people do not refer to long-term sojourners in Japan as immigrants. Okay, more often they are referred to as, you know, in casual conversation, as just foreigners. So what about integration policy? Or if there are no immigrants, you don't really have to have an integration policy, right? So this creates a real conflict between the national government and the local government, right? At the national level, migration is seen as temporary. Of course, people can naturalize, right? That's available after a while and fulfilling the criteria. But for the most part, migration is seen as temporary, short-term stays. So there's not a need for integration policy. At the local level, you know, the reality is quite different. Local governments actually see the number of migrants increasing over time and stays lengthening over time. Okay? And so it is in their best interest, in the community's best interest, to figure out how to incorporate these migrants into the local communities. All right. So local NGOs, planners, policymakers have really taken the lead on thinking about and figuring out how to integrate at the local level. I think one indication of the national government's failure at integration policy is that Japan is the only developed country with a 4th generation immigrant incorporation problem. So those descendants of Koreans and Taiwanese that I talked about earlier, they are not Japanese citizens unless they have naturalized, right? So for them, this is an ongoing issue. Naturalization used to be quite problematic because it was very onerous. It required that people change their names, renounce their culture, and submit to home inspections to demonstrate that they were living in a culturally Japanese way. These have changed a bit, partly because of the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination that I mentioned earlier. Other signs of aversion to multicultural society, pronouncements from political elite. Over time, I just give a few examples here. 1980, the Ministry of Justice Immigration Bureau Chief, Mr. Kosugi, said in a judicial committee meeting, actually they were debating and discussing whether Japan would accept refugees and adopt the International Refugee Convention. And in his testimony, he stated that, quote, as a matter of national policy, Japan absolutely does not accept foreigners. 1986, Prime Minister Nakasone got into a lot of trouble when he said, quote, on average, the United States is lower because of a considerable number of blacks, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans. 1990, Minister of Defense Kajiyama actually got into a lot of trouble, this 4 years later, when he compared foreign prostitutes in Tokyo Shinjuku Ward, which I talked a little bit about a few minutes ago, to Black Americans when he alleged that they both, quote, ruin the atmosphere. In those two cases, 1986, 1990, these are high-level government representatives who are actually speaking in settings where, that were public, and Nakasone, I believe, was actually in the United States. So, of course, they issued apologies, and they tried to explain and insist that the comments were not meant to be racist or to demonstrate bias. And they said instead, we come from Japan. It's a homogeneous country. We don't understand difference, and so this is why we make these kinds of mistakes. Very interesting. And of course, in 2000, you can't talk about this without having something from the provocative Tokyo governor, Ishihara, who told the Japan Self-Defense Forces, quote, atrocious crimes have been committed again and again by Sankokujin and other foreigners. We have to expect them to riot in the event of disastrous earthquake. Sankokujin is a derogatory term used in post-war period to refer to the Chinese and Koreans who remained in Japan after the end of the war. It's still a quite painful word for them to hear. And his comments also invoked the 1923 earthquake in Japan, when there were, in the wake of the earthquake, massacres of a number of Koreans, especially because folks are whipped up and thinking that they're committing mass crimes and those sorts of things. So there's this, the statements and the discussion of political elites also demonstrate this kind of aversion to multicultural society. Okay. And I should mention that some of those international human rights laws and conventions that I talked about earlier, Japan has signed on to all of those things, and that's what's quite interesting, is that you see that part of what's happening is that those folks at the local level who are trying to shape integration policy, who are trying to encourage integration of their foreign residents into the local communities, are actually drawing off of those the resources in those international commitments to deal with their own local issues. So, despite the tough talk on immigration, the gaffes about, talking about minority groups in the U.S., there's actually been attempts at internationalizing or diversifying Japanese society. The earliest that we see is this, what's referred to as kokusaika, which means internationalization. This was in the 1980s, initiatives to actually improve international understanding of Japan and to expose Japanese to foreign cultures. And the way they did this was, three-pronged. One, by recruiting foreign college graduates to the JET program, the Japan Exchange Teaching, which many of you may be familiar with and might even be considering after graduation. If you are, I would say go, do it. And so bringing English, teaching English, exposing Japanese people to more English and also to native speakers of English was really important. And something that's interesting is that early on, there was a bias for these English speakers to be white. And so if you had Asian Americans, for example, who wanted to go to JET, and interviews are part of this process. So if you had Asian Americans who wanted to go and do the JET program, they might, you know, get a little bit lower priority, because who wants to learn English from somebody who looks like you? You know, it's like, I don't want to do that. So that has changed over time. But in the 1980s, it was very prevalent. Second was increasing the number of exchange students to Japan through Ministry of Education scholarships. This was exchange students from everywhere, from all over the world. A lot of folks from Asia, a lot of folks from the US, Canada, all over. So they would come and study, interact with other students, and, you know, hopefully promote this kind of international understanding. And third, there was a real push, government policy, leisure policy, to encourage Japanese to travel abroad. Okay. So that was the Kokusaika initiatives. The 1990s local policy initiatives to integrate foreign residents into communities at the municipal and local levels are the Tabunka Kyosei policies. And these policies focus on the everyday life of foreign residents. It focuses on them as valuable members of the community. It focuses on their contributions to the community beyond their worth as economic producers. Okay, and it's really interesting because these policies also get away from the idea that foreigners are a threat or dangerous, potential criminals, that sort of thing. Okay, so I think that these two policies actually represent two kinds of multicultural, what we might call multicultural logics. The first one, this internationalization, it's an unreflective multiculturalism, diversity, based on cultural consumption, right? And so this kind of policy, it really does put the consumer at the center of any kind of transaction, right? The consumer in this case is going to be a Japanese person who's really trying to, you know, have some ethnic food or go experience a foreign culture somewhere. And so it really does not highlight or value the agency, the individuality of the person who is representing the other, the difference in this case. The Tabunka Kyosei policies, as you can hear from my description, are really much more a type of lived multiculturalism. It's about encouraging recognition of these individuals' human rights, and there's much more of a focus on social justice, okay, in that approach. So getting back to Okubo, which I sort of started sketching out in the beginning. I'm gonna not talk so much about the next two slides, and we can come back to them. I just really wanted to talk about how Okubo has always been a little bit edgy. It's always been a place of diversity and difference, okay? It was, you know, sort of early on a suburban residential area. It was where intellectuals often lived, missionaries, people who were slightly, you know, kind of on the edge of society, communists, eventually hippies, you know, so it changed with the time. And so it's always had this kind of history of diversity. Really tied up with what's going on internationally, and that actually helped to drive some of the economic prosperity in Okubo. But if you have questions about that in Q&A, I'd be happy to talk about it. So foreign residents in Tokyo, I just wanted to give you a sense. You know, it's always helpful to look at a map. I think planners think. So here's a map for you. This is a map of central Tokyo, the 23-ku, or the 23 wards, okay? There's also Tokyo suburbs, but they're not represented on the map. So this is the central part of the city. Here, you may not be able to see too much. It's a gray loop. That's the main loop line, the Yamanote line, the main train line that loops the city, okay? And so this area, living close to the Yamanote, is often very expensive, more expensive than some of these outer areas, although there's great train access everywhere in Japan, right? So you can see from 2000 to 2006, the intensity of the changes in the intensity of the color show you the change in the population. Shinjuku is here, already pretty dark, you know, darkest part of the map in 2000, but look at 2006, even more so. You also have changes in Minato-ku, more Westerners in this area, a lot of embassies, a lot of Americans, other people too, but this area is known much more for Western folks. Adachi, here. I actually went up there, it seems so far, but you know, it's in central Tokyo, cheaper to live. I found that there are many Philippine residents here. Also, Zainichi Korean residents as well. So those resident Koreans who have been in Japan for a very long time, also living in this area. Edogawa. Yeah. But Shinjuku is very interesting when we think about that. So you can kind of see, and I'll give you some numbers as well. This next slide, I apologize, not very good. Well, it's not too bad, but it's small. This is the number of registered foreign residents in Shinjuku Ward by nationality and gender. The data is from December 2006. It's a while ago. You can only get this stuff from if you go to the ward office. And actually, when I rode up to Adachi, they just had the information sitting out in these books on the shelves, and so I just copied it all. And I got to Shinjuku, and I'm like, where's the stuff? They had nothing out. You had to ask for everything. And I was convinced, because sometimes it's very bureaucratic in Japan, it can be hard to get data. And so when I went to Shinjuku Ward and I was asking about it, I just said, I'm very surprised that this information is just not available. I mean, I went out to Adachi and it was right there on the shelf. Sort of trying to play up like, I went way out to the countryside over there to that, area way on the outskirts of Tokyo and was able to get it no problem. Surely Shinjuku Ward has this information available for a researcher like myself. And that actually got me the information. So I was able to put together these tables. The data are official statistics. And it's interesting to note here that of the Koreans listed, approximately 1,512 are Zainichi, or resident Koreans, and approximately 42 are resident Taiwanese. And I knew that because of the category, their visa classification, when I was compiling the data. If they were permanent residents, they were Zainichi, resident Koreans, or resident Taiwanese. You should also note that what's interesting is that the number does not include ethnic Koreans who hold Chinese citizenship. They're included in the numbers for China. So it gets very complicated a lot of times to even try to figure out what's the composition of the population. Ethnically and nationally, there's a real big difference there. So one of the things that's difficult in Japan is finding an apartment. Everyone in Japan, including Japanese people, needs to have a guarantor to rent an apartment. Somebody to vouch for you, basically, I guess, if you skip out on the rent or destroy anything, right? And these kinds of services, usually people will have like an employer or, maybe their parents or someone like that vouch for them. you know, foreigners don't necessarily have that. And so you have here services, management companies that will provide that kind of service to foreign people. So for rent foreigners, I don't know if they're renting foreigners or if they're, no, they're not renting foreigners. Providing that kind of service to foreign people in Japan who need to find apartments. And so this is, I took all of the photos in this presentation myself. So this is a sign from Okubo demonstrating again that there is enough migration on the ground to warrant this kind of thing. I was taken on a tour by one of the leaders of a community organization. He was a longtime Shinjuku resident. He was very interested in multiculturalism, multicultural policies, and promoting integration at the local level. And I was struck because this is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Korean newspapers. Really? There's nobody here but us Japanese, I swear. Yeah, so, but I asked them, you know, because I said, well, I know there's a lot of Zainichi Koreans in this area. Could these newspapers be aimed at them? Because there's a Korean school in Shinjuku as well. A lot of Zainichis in the area can actually speak Korean. And he said, actually, there are some newspapers that are aimed at that population, but they're usually written in Japanese. And assured me that these publications were aimed at newer, what they call newcomer Koreans in the area. So very interesting. This is a restaurant, just, you know, a random restaurant on the side street in Okubo. And what was interesting, I don't know if you can tell from here, there was one sign in Japanese that said kimchi gohan, kimchi rice. The rest of it is in Korean. All of these are menu items. I couldn't tell what it was. And so what does this tell us? I mean, I thought, you know, one of two explanations. One, it was aimed at a Korean population in the area who could read that signage no problem. And I'd actually been taken to such a restaurant by some Korean folks who I was interviewing during this project. And, you know, so that's possible. Another possibility is that it's actually, you know, people go there for some kind of authentic ethnic experience. So maybe they can't read Korean, but they can see those pictures, right? So maybe Japanese people are coming from all over Japan and they're tourists in the area and they're eating at a Korean restaurant in Tokyo where they can't read the signs and having this authentic kind of cosmopolitan experience in this area. So kind of interesting. Actually, as a side note, this area, it's a tourist attraction for people from Korea. Okay, so there are a lot of Koreans who live in the area, but then you see tour buses from, you know, folks come into Tokyo for the weekend from Korea, and they come to this as one of the sites they want to see, all those Koreans in Tokyo. This is Korean Bazaar, Kankoku Hiroba, selling groceries and other goods needed for daily life, things, you know, ethnic goods that you need, as well as produce and things like that. Open 24 hours, 365 days a year. You can see a little English there, calling card, letting all kinds of international folks in the area know that they sell international calling cards, so you can keep in touch with your folks at home. I don't know if you can see this, but these signs inside the store are actually in Korean. And something that struck me was this produce, it looks good and fresh. It's really cheap too. So I had no explanation for that, but I thought maybe this is the place to shop. This shop I really like, partly because it demonstrates the complexity of the diversity in this area, okay? So, Kankokushiki Chuka Ryori, this is Korean-style Chinese food, okay? So these are probably Koreans who came from China who are running this place. This actually says that it's the Shinjuku branch, so maybe there's other branches, maybe this is really popular. And a friend of mine, actually colleague, Jim came, I was with Jim Spencer on some of this research, and another colleague from Hawaii, and the Korean colleague assured me that this said fast delivery. I have no idea though. If anybody can read it, let me know, because I always say that. I have no idea if it actually says fast delivery. But and you see the man in the window making fresh noodles from scratch. This is also very telling about the area. For many Koreans, church is a central part of life, right? And this church, you can't see the sign here, but this tells the times when they have services in Japanese and times when they have services in Korean. And there's a lot of services, okay? But yeah, so this is, this becomes very central to the Korean community in Okubo. Some of the reading that I did suggested that even folks who were not observant, Christians who went to church on the regular when they were in Korea, that this was a place where they could, connect with co-ethnics, but also a place where they could network, and it became very important for business. Okay, so talk a little bit more about ethnic town Okubo. Remember, there's this development of Okubo over time, and it eventually becomes ethnic town Okubo and Shinjuku's Tabunka Kyosei policies. There's actually, once Shinjuku created its Tabunka Kyosei policies in 2004, that's when Okubo became understood as an ethnic town, Okubo. So part of what happens when communities create these local multicultural or Tabunka Kyosei policies is that they create, a multicultural plaza or room or some place where people can gather, and they might provide various services depending on the area. So Shinjuku Ward opened its plaza in 2005, and there's the aim. This is taken from the pamphlet, from the promotional pamphlet. So the aim of this multicultural plaza is to promote the development of a city where people from various cultures can live in harmony. This plaza will be a place where Japanese and non-Japanese residents can have friendly exchanges and deepen their understanding of each other's culture and history. Certainly this message is one of mutual respect. It's clearly in line with and articulates the multicultural model of dealing with migrants that I talked about earlier. It's really interesting. I did the translation. It says non-Japanese. It doesn't use the word foreigner here, so it doesn't say, a place where Japanese and foreigners can have friendly exchanges. So it's very interesting. And this place, one of the things I thought was quite interesting is that I heard about it from a number of different folks. People at the Korean embassy told me about it. Community leaders actually told me about it, and they were all saying, you have to go. It's a place that anybody can use. Any kind of migrant can go there, even if you're illegal, even if you're an overstayer. If you need help, you can go there. You don't have to show your residence card. You don't have to show a passport. And so they were very proud of this fact and really thought that was something that was notable. And certainly the space, the space seems kind of generic, but there's a lot that goes on there, from Japanese language classes, culture classes, and other kinds of activities as well that's aimed at a smooth integration for foreign residents. They even had volunteers who spoke other languages, and depending on the days and time available, they had consultation in English, Thai, Korean, Hindi, Chinese. Again, depending. So, of all the 23 wards in Tokyo, that map I showed, Shinjuku is actually the one that's taking the lead on establishing multicultural policies. It's at the forefront of it. It actually, 10% of Shinjuku Ward's 300,000 people are foreign residents. And they actually promote their diversity on their website as a draw. They call themselves the city of 100 cultures, and they see that as something that's quite positive. While other areas certainly might have their website in Japanese and English, Shinjuku has the distinction of having their website in 4 languages: Japanese, English, Chinese, and Korean, and maybe more nowadays. So they really play that up and really want people to have access to it. Okubo area is actually the most diverse of Shinjuku's 11 administrative districts. And excuse me, I think that that's something that's quite interesting as well. The local government, so the Shinjuku Ward government, actually builds on the history of diversity and openness of Okubo, really playing up this idea that it's always been a place where all kinds of people have been welcome. I was saying that Okubo's population, foreign population, is the highest of the 11 administrative areas, a little bit more than 22%. That's quite significant. I mean, very significant. And it's not just, diversity in one area. It's diversity in work. It's diversity at all levels of education. It's diversity in commercial activities. And so it's a very interesting and seems much more organic than company towns, industrial centers that have attracted, say the Nikkei gene and other folks. One thing though is that, I really want to draw attention to the fact that these policies are also, they're constitutive. They help to create a place where diversity is valued and celebrated, where people of all kinds are welcome, but they're also quite regulative, right? The government has started to do all kinds of research on their foreign resident population, and this allows them to provide much better services, but it also provides them with the opportunity to discipline the area, and I'll say a little bit more about that soon. There's also a way in which focusing on multiculturalism actually further separates foreignness and ethnicity from other kinds of difference. And in this area, I think that one ways that we can see this is that even though there's this celebration of all these, ethnicities and cultures, quite nearby there is a very large area of gay bars in Shinjuku Nichome, but that is, kind of pushed off to the side. It's not seen as part of the diversity of the area, part of what's interesting and valuable about the place. So again, the old wooden apartments here, government strategies, when I talked about these policies actually helping to discipline foreign residents, government strategies have actually eliminated the outward markers of difference in residents, right? So there was a time, Yoshiko Inaba actually talks about, she did really extensive research in this area, first in the early 90s, then in the early 2000s. And she said, in the early 90s, you used to be able to look at the outside of a place and you could tell if Japanese or non-Japanese lived in the area, or in the apartment. And she said, by the early 2000s, all those telltale signs were gone. And these signs might be improperly stored bikes, other kinds of things that are just outside and out of the norm, out of the ordinary. Here you see a very clean stoop. Also, you see signage, right? So signs in Japanese Chinese, English. I think this is Thai and Korean, telling people how to dispose of their garbage properly. So, you know, multilingual signage helps foreign residents to feel more comfortable in an area. They feel informed, they know what's going on, they know people care about them. On the other hand, one of the biggest complaints, well, I could say two biggest complaints by Japanese about their foreign neighbors. One is that they're too loud. Two is that they don't know how to throw their garbage away. And so makes the folks feel makes everybody feel more comfortable, I guess. Again, has a way of making sure that people are fitting in, that their behavior is governed by these kinds of public service announcements, billboards, and other things that also at the same time makes them feel more at home. Uh-oh. What happened to that? There should be a picture here. It totally is. It was right here and it really disappeared right before my eyes. Okay, maybe it'll come back. So the photo that was supposed to be there, I'll just tell you a little bit about, because I talked about how local NGOs, planners, and policymakers are very important for these multicultural initiatives. Another important group are teachers. In Okubo, in my own volunteer experience in 2010, 2011 in Kobe, you often saw that teachers had a really central role in integration. And the photo was of a classroom in the Okubo Elementary School, which actually has 60% foreign resident children. And the teacher had arranged his classroom in a way that students could bring things and write essays and then post them in this area that he'd set up that talked about their life before coming to Japan and their life after arriving in Japan. He encouraged them to bring artifacts from their home country to, sort of help other children to understand what their life was like, help them understand something about another culture. And that was really interesting. He developed a curriculum to deal with the needs of all of these foreign resident children in an education system that does not have Japanese as a second language curriculum. And so he was really involved in the community, trying to help bridge the gaps between a rapidly diversifying community and, sort of the long-term Japanese residents. And his goal, one of his goals, he said, was not only for students to be able to successfully integrate into local area, but for local people, for Japanese people to recognize the value of having a diverse community. And so I thought that was really interesting that this teacher saw this as part of his mission. So just to conclude, to wrap up, glad I won't go quite for an hour, but to wrap up, the question now is whether Tabunka Kyosei policies indicate a new policy perspective that includes a preferred set of options for achieving integration, or merely a disparate set of actions that deal with the issue of foreigners in general terms, okay? Because nothing is regularized across the country, so we're not quite sure what's gonna happen. Despite the absence of a comprehensive national policy and the variability of policies at the local level, there is some indication that the concept of Tabunka Kyosei actually signals that local governments are developing a slightly different, more nuanced way of understanding foreigners in Japan. So you hear now at the local level, less talk about foreigners or gaikokujin and more talk about foreign residents, okay? So foreign residents recognizing people as both outsiders, you know, foreigners, gaikokujin, or foreign nationals, gaikokuseki, and insiders as well. Okay, so local residents, jumin. So gaikokujin jumin is what is often being discussed at the local level now. Gaikokuseki jumin, not just outsiders. For its part, Okubo is a politicized space in which political practices and policies such as Tabunka Kyosei or multicultural policies constitute the meaning and significance of Okubo as an ethnic town and help to manage ethnic immigrant places. Okay? These policies are at the cutting edge of political practices, though they do not manage, you know, diversity or migration directly. They create a structure that manages migrants through the production of an identity that largely depends on commercial activity in Okubo. So all of the restaurants you saw, right? The stores that you saw. I didn't show pictures of video stores selling, you know, Korean wave goods, so Korean popular culture, movies, CDs, that sort of thing, but tons of those kinds of things. Despite this focus, migrants do exercise agency, okay? They do this through their everyday activities that challenge the attempts to structure their lives in certain ways, right? So the way that they use space, the way that they use public space. It became a gathering of foreigners at one time became a problem in the late 1990s. The group that was being discussed at that time specifically was Iranians. There was an NHK special. This is a main Japanese television station, it's like public TV, did a whole story about all of the Iranians that were gathering in Yoyogi Park in Tokyo on the weekends. Yoyogi Park is a huge green space, you know, people are doing all kinds of things, playing frisbees, practicing instruments, practicing plays, dance routines, all kinds of things. But Iranians would come, sell goods to each other, exchange information, pick up soccer games, whatever. But for some people, apparently it was disturbing. And, you know, one of the lines that, you know, they interviewed some folks around Yoyogi asking them what they thought about what was going on in the Iranian use of this park on the weekends, and somebody said, Tehran mitai, like it looks like Tehran around here on the weekends. And so that became an issue about the appropriate use of space and gathering of large groups and those kinds of things. And that's one way, you know, in some ways that's discouraged, but the fact that people do it actually challenges the kinds of structures that are in place to try to manage their behavior, to try to manage where they go and how they live. Okay, so I said this earlier, but Tabunka Kyosei policies draw from global norms when they frame local discussions of diversity, difference, that challenges that national level discourse of Japan not being an immigrant country, okay, of a country that does not have long-term settlement. In the future, we'll see if this results in a sustained focus on difference and lived multiculturalism, or if it lapses into a consumer-oriented focus on diversity for the sake of consumption. So I'll end it there. I welcome all kinds of questions and I'll answer as best I can. Thank you so much. I know that was long. Thank you for paying attention though. Yeah.
What is it? Is it the value or is it dealing with externality?
I think it's both, actually. I think that, you know, the local governments, I think, should get credit for the kinds of things they're trying to do, right? I mean, this is so different. It challenges just the understanding that people have about foreigners and who they are and their potential and what they do when they come to Japan. And I think that that's incredible, okay? But of course, I mean, some of this is actually a necessity because they have so many foreign residents living in their midst, and you need to start to think about how that population is going to interact with the local community, right? And so a lot of these policies, they come out of necessity, I think. I mean, the first area to institute multicultural policies and to under this name of Tabunka Kyosei was Osaka. I mean, that's one of the most diverse cities in Japan. It has the largest community of Zainichi Korean residents. And so, yeah, I think some of it is necessity, right? But I think that that's why when you look at these policies, you have to recognize just how cutting edge they are and the potential for thinking about difference in a way that values multiculturalism and a diverse society. But you also still have that regulative aspect that, you know, comes with the policies as well, right? So conducting all of this research to figure out who's living in your community, what their needs are for education and healthcare and other things, that helps people to, you know, integrate, to feel as they're a part of the community. But at the same time, it arms the local government with information they need to try to regulate that population as well. And so I think it's both. I don't think it's either or. So I don't know if you find that satisfying, but I think it's both. Yeah.
It's okay to ask a hypothetical question. Those are hard to answer, but I'm curious if immigration policy in Japan were to be relaxed and become very open, and you know, probably will happen, but if it were, what groups would want to immigrate and who would potentially become Japanese citizens? Who would be lining up to enter the country and then, you know, permanently become citizens? What would that profile look like? You had a table there of
Yeah.
some of the existing.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
If it's possible to know that.
You know, what's interesting is I think that people who go to Tokyo and people who go to Shinjuku in particular, I actually don't think they're necessarily going to Japan. I think they're attracted to a cosmopolitan city, right? And that's attractive to many of people in many of Japan's Asian neighbors, right? And so there is still a large population of Koreans. They are considered much more transnational migrants because they go back and forth. A lot of times, you know, what's interesting is that they're very different from the Zainichi resident Koreans because they don't necessarily want citizenship. They don't necessarily want to stay continuously. They live in both places and they like being able to do that. And so I think, you know, I'm not quite sure that it would only be people who want to go and get citizenship and sort of settle down and stay. But there's folks like that. There are also people who, you know, so that cosmopolitan, you know, kind of searching for their own kind of experience, right? There's that. But then you also have people who really see it as an economic move, okay? A lot of those are Philippine women, just like everywhere else in the world. You know, the Philippines' largest, exporters are people. And so a lot of Philippine women in Japan, and actually a visa category I did not talk about is the entertainer visa, which until the crackdown or tightening, restricting of that visa for Philippine women in particular, it was, you know, about probably close to 90% of the people going to Japan on an entertainer visa were women from the Philippines. And so certainly that's a population that finds the work opportunities in Japan attractive. They often also work as domestics, often for Westerners in the area, working as cleaners, all those things that, you know, help whatever they can do to actually achieve their economic goals more often. This is interesting because I'm just thinking about how this is being shaped, because in Japan, the way they've shaped it is, you know, different groups have different categories, that hierarchy, you know, so there's also a group of Philippine women and Indonesian women who go to Japan as nurses. The aging population means that there is a shortage of elder care. And so a new visa category has been created. And those people can stay long term, but the Japanese language test is often seen as a barrier. And they work long hours, so they often don't have enough time to study. So they have a 3-year visa that can be extended and all of that, but often it's difficult to get that language requirement down. So, you know, I really think that it's the same people that you see everywhere else. There's a lot of Africans in Japan, especially in the Tokyo metro area. There's almost nothing written about them in English. And that's, you know, so that's very interesting. People are often surprised by that. So I think, you know, folks from everywhere would be interested in going to Japan and, you know, seeking their fortune or possibly settling down. I don't know if that helps, but yeah.
So, as you know, the long-term economic health of Japan looks like it could be in deep trouble because they're already in huge debt and they have a very low birth rate and a rapidly aging population that are going to be retiring and a workforce that's shrinking. Is there any appreciation of the fact that economically it seems like allowing more immigration is kind of the only way that they can possibly keep their economy vibrant? And if so, is there any change in cultural attitudes based or people advocating changes?
Yeah. Not in that direction. At one time, you did have some politicians who said, well, we could be small. Why do we need to be a big country? You know? And so that's one approach that people say, why do we need that? We don't, you know, because there's all these numbers that come out, you know, that in the next 20 to 50 years, Japan needs, you know, hundreds of thousands of immigrants in order to actually sustain itself. But there is no willingness for that. I mean, the political will is not there to allow this kind of large scale immigration. And so what you continue to see is a creation of new visa categories, of new agreements with neighboring countries to allow, you know, this group nurses or, you know, this group whatever they feel like they need at the time. And actually this economic issue became really sort of controversial in 2008 because by that time the largest number of foreign blue-collar workers in Japan were those Nikkei who had been encouraged to come to Japan. There were about 366,000 of them. The Japanese government thought with the economic downturn, they would become a burden. They actually started to offer one-way ticket home and a lump sum, but the person could never come back to Japan. So much for family visiting, right? And could never seek work in Japan again. And so that was, you know, sort of an approach to, you know, this is going to become a burden. At one time it was great and possibly helpful. We can't sustain anymore. So, you know, so when you have this kind of approach to dealing with immigration, when the economy is going up and down, it's really difficult to see how there would be the will to create a sustainable immigration policy that encourages migration to Japan. So I don't see it happening. And there's not a whole lot, I mean, you know, scholars and folks discuss it, but there's not much else besides that, I don't think. Yeah, unfortunately.
I'm curious about whether or not you see a dichotomy between the rural areas and the urban areas in their response to immigration, and you know, whether you might actually see more tolerance potentially in rural areas or even less in the rural areas compared to the national construction.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about the rural areas is that people seem much more welcoming and tolerant than I would imagine. You know, you always think of the rural area in Japan as the furusato, right? Like the village, the the home place, and you imagine these places as being deeply conservative. But a lot of those places, I mean, the migration looks different. In a lot of these places, they have, there's depopulation, and so the migrants that you see coming in are foreign women who are marrying Japanese men in the area, and so that's, that looks a little bit different than folks who are just coming to work and that sort of thing, right? These are people who are founding families and really committed to staying for a while. And so, and there was actually a bit of controversy, I believe it was at the end of the 90s, some of these local governments were actually sponsoring these kinds of like huge, I don't know, marriage malls or something, so, to find these wives for the local male residents. And so, yeah, so there's that difference. I mean, the reason why people go to local areas is a little bit different. It's usually that kind of migration and not so much really going to work for economic need or to get, skills that you need and that sort of thing. So, yeah. One other thing that's a little bit troubling is that technical intern and trainee program. A lot of companies that make use of that are small and medium-sized companies, and a lot of these are located, they're far out and not necessarily in the city centers, and so you see a lot of people who get dispatched to employers in these areas, and they potentially get into trouble. They are potentially victims of trafficking because they're tied to one employer. Their first year, up until 2010, and sort of investigations, their first year they were not covered by Japanese labor laws, and their employers, they cannot change their employer. They're tied to that employer for the 3 years, and employers would often control their movement, their communication, and their documents as well. And so, you saw these kinds of folks popping up, but a lot of times, if employers were really confining them to dorms or regulating how much they could go out, local folks a lot of times didn't even know that there were foreign workers in this particular area. So, that's a case where you have people coming in, but they're not at all, they're documented, but they're not at all integrated. So, yeah. Yes, sir.
I have a two-part question. The American military has been there for about 70 years. Do they still view the Americans as foreigners, or are they part of the society? And my second part of my question is, you looked at Tokyo. I've been to Osaka. Would those same attitudes hold for other big cities?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. First question is, the American military is very, very interesting because they are not subject to Japanese immigration laws at all. Okay, so there's not a whole lot of documentation aside from what the U.S. government keeps track of in terms of who they're sending back and forth, of who's actually there. The Japanese government has no control. They're outside of the control of immigration policy, and it's the same in a lot of places. There's a really interesting book called Borderline Japan, and Tessa Morris Suzuki talks about that. I mean, she's a historian, so she talks about the historical development of that in East Asia, so especially Japan and Korea, post-war through the 1950s and all of that you actually have another kind of archipelago on top of this, and those are the spaces where American military bases are, Okinawa, Korea, other parts of Japan, and they are tied together by these, military personnel that are going from place to place, actually, making these connections, but there's no records of this kind of movement, so there's no control of it. So in some ways, they're foreign and they're not, because, they're certainly outsiders. They're not integrated into society, but they're even a little bit more removed from that, right? Because foreign residents, a lot of this, I should say too, a lot of these numbers, and documentation talk about foreign residents. So these are people who are registered, they're in the country on a specific kind of visa, they have their alien registration card and all that good stuff. And American military does not need that kind of alien registration and all of that.
But on occasion, some of the soldiers marry Japanese women and stay in Japan. So are they considered immigrant residents? How are they considered?
Well, in that case, their status changes, right? Because once they're no longer a part of the American military, they can actually get some kind of residency permit in Japan based on a spouse. So their category changes. The way that they are actually viewed under Japanese law is different then. Yeah. So their status changes, and that's really important because I mean that status matters. Yeah. What do you mean? Say more. Because I could go a lot of ways with that.
In the rural,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
so, like you see in Korea too, there's a lot of this kind of markets for spouses.
Yeah.
And they're very clearly markets. So
Yeah, right.
There are spousal tours. that
Right.
Go to Indonesia and Vietnam.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you have these multicultural marriages. It's
Yeah.
very difficult to distance kids from those marriages.
Right.
The same way that you can distance foreign residents.
Right.
So there's that case, then there's the American military, which presumably there are some kids from
Yeah.
those unions
Yeah.
that stay in Japan.
Yeah.
How are those kids treated? Presumably at this point are not just kids. but they're-
Right. Well, it depends because then the issue of race becomes more complicated.
Yeah.
I think that historically in Japan, whiteness has been valued more, as is in the case in a lot of places. And so those kinds of children might not face as difficult a time, of course, depending on where they live and that sort of thing. So that in Tokyo, I came across an ad for a group for wives of Nigerians, right? So not just like wives of Africans, but wives of, so that people form these networks, and in that way, I think they get that support. They build their own communities in that way. But it depends. It runs the gamut. It really does, and I think it makes a difference if both parents are present or not. That matters. I think now it's to the point where they might face less discrimination, especially the children of Black Americans or Africans and Japanese. But I think it can still be very difficult. There's a good film that was made actually within the last couple years. It's called Hafu, because that's how they often refer to these children, as Hafu, they're half. And it talks about a lot of that. And that film shows how it remains difficult to exist in that kind of place, right? That you're inside and outside. So, yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part. The cultural differences were what?
Do you think that some of their protectionism, like because of the economics and results from the resistance towards other cultures? Or is it just purely economic?
Well, I think there's a couple things, right? I think that when you talk about Japan from an economic perspective, I think that while you have to recognize that yes, it's a democracy, it's a free market economy, that there's a lot of, historically in Japan, there's been a lot of skepticism about the operation of the free market, right? That there's a lot of involvement in guiding corporate policies, right? Like I think that things are much more open and much more of a kind of a free-for-all in the U.S., right? That in the U.S. there's almost this, kind of fervor about belief in the market, and I don't think that that's there in Japan. I think that folks in Japan tend to be a little bit more skeptical about that. So that's one piece of it. But I think also, even after the war and the dissolution of the zaibatsu, the conglomerates, that kind of structure actually reemerged. And so you have those kinds of connections there as well. And I mean, you have to think about how culture plays into business practices and that sort of thing. But, you know, I think that culture is important, but there are also other kinds of things, right? That I'm not quite sure that skepticism of the market in Japan can be said to be cultural. Like, I'm just not sure of that, okay? So that may account for some aspects, but, you know, I think you really have to look at the structure of the economy, the role of corporations, right? That corporations were not just there to make money. Corporations were supposed to be benevolent employers who took care of their employees. You know, the larger ones paid the family wage and offered lifetime employment, but many more were medium and small companies that didn't have those kinds of benefits. So definitely you have to look at those things, probably in addition to culture. I don't think that culture is a significant explanatory factor there. But that's my opinion. That's really just based on, you know, my own personal thought. Okay. Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. As a Japanese, I native Japanese from Tokyo and Suminari, and I really enjoy your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And I just live in Tokyo for a long time, and teaching Japanese language here also.
Okay.
And every year I go back to Japan. But honestly speaking, Okubo is to me, how to say, when I was a child, when I was a college student, stay away simply.
Yes, right?
It's dangerous.
Right, exactly.
But when I go back, my friends said, Okubo has been changed.
Yeah.
So interesting. Nice Korean food. Not only Korean food,
Right.
there are so many ethnic foods.
Right.
So every time my friend, invited me to go there, but still I have some,
Right.
Go that one. So next time, I'm planning to go over there. So I'm the average Japanese, my age, have some kind of prejudice towards the town of Okubo and the toward the residents of the area. But definitely this is changing. So that means the Japanese globalization
Yes.
is really positively going on.
Yeah, yeah.
And also as a Japanese language teacher, I have a lot of chance to participate in conference, and I heard demonstration and report about how the Japanese language education is going on to the foreigners' children.
Yes.
And there are a lot of programs. So
Yeah.
the Japanese municipalities are trying to help
Yeah.
their language because they don't know, parents don't know Japanese.
Right.
And children is learning Japanese quickly.
Right.
So that means there's a gap, the communication gap in foreigners' children and
Right.
families.
Right.
So the Japanese government is trying to fill up that. So
Right.
Japanese teach. There's some Brazilian.
Yes.
Portuguese, some Spanish courses going on.
Right, right,
So that's
right.
really the beginning of a nice Japanese.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for that. I mean, I think that sharing that and talking about how when you were growing up, this was not a place where you should go. You should, stay away from that place, and how that's changed over time. And I think
I'm from Ogikubo, and Okubo is how many stations?
Yes.
4 or 5 stations.
yes.
But I have to stay away from
Right, exactly. Just, skip over that one. Don't get off there. Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. If you have time afterwards, I didn't answer your question about Osaka and talk more about the Kansai region. So, if you want to just chat about that afterwards, we can do that. But thank you so much for, your time and attention. I really had a good time. Thanks.
Great, so thanks for coming. Next week there'll be another discussion about communities and policing and the law from 4 to 6 on Thursday.